Hello, everyone. Quick announcement before we start up this podcast episode. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, my Premiere Pro is just being really glitchy, and my normal Ultra Key that I use on Subaru's model was not working, so it completely removed all the color from his face. So you're gonna have a black and white Subaru for this episode. There's nothing wrong with it. I just could not figure out a solution, and we wanted to get this out on time, so please enjoy a black and white Subaru. Thank you so very much, and enjoy the episode. Bye!
Hello there! Welcome to the ReZero podcast. I'm your host, Wolf. You may know me as the voice actor for Subaru in our Arc 5 readings of the ReZero web novel. Today, we'll be discussing and analysing Subaru from ReZero. And I'll be doing it with my wonderful co-hosts here. Introduce yourselves, please, gentlemen.
Hello, I'm Gold, and who's Subaru? I've never heard of that character before. That being said, on to our other host, Connor.
I'm Connor. I am the voice actor for Julius and Kiritaka, and I have some things to say about Subaru over here.
Disgusting.
How in character of him.
Yes. So today is our first episode of our character deep dives. Going forward, when we're covering these, if we can, we're also going to try and make sure that our own voice actors for that character have joined us for that when possible, which it obviously is today, since we have our lead voice actor for Subaru here right now.
Hi!
Even in Subaru persona form.
Yes, there's extra levels of irony here.
I think it's just being appropriate. But Today we're going to be covering everything from his history, his powers, relationships with other characters, like his whole character arc, and just do a super deep dive on him. So if that sounds good to you both, I think it's best that we just jump right into it today, huh?
Yes,
Well,
please.
doesn't it sound good to me? So let's do it.
Excited!
All right, so let's start with the most boring part of Subaru's character, his history. Like, where does he come from? Who is this random isekai protagonist that we've got here?
He just comes from a town in Japan. He's a young teenage man from an average place in Japan. Nothing stands out about him in his background at all.
And let's talk about that a bit, because one thing that I find very interesting about Subaru compared to some other isekai protagonists is that actually Subaru's backstory isn't like as traditional neat as it comes.
Yeah, that's true.
No, not at all. I mean, it's hard to... He is technically a NEET, and for those of you at home who don't know what that means, it's not in education, employment, or training. NEET.
So let me qualify that some more then. What I mean is that in a lot of isekai, the protagonists are kind of just losers. Like, they've always been losers, they're just nerd losers, and that's really the descript part about them. You know? They're bullied, they're ostracized, and then they get a chance to have this escapism fantasy. Subaru's situation isn't quite so simple.
At least a good chunk of isekai protagonists are. You also have like the standard salaryman who either gets randomly killed or maybe like an office worker lady who overworks herself to death. If we even get the backstory of who these people are. And I'm very glad we get it for Subaru. Because as you said, he isn't traditional in that regard. He is a little bit different from the usual NEET, even if he is almost the epitome of what it is to be a shut-in, hikikomori.
Yeah, and it's like, as I said before, like as you brought up, this isn't traditional in isekai protagonist. Rather, the author seems kind of playing their hand a bit, where they're like, okay, I as an author and you as a reader, I don't want you to care about who the protagonist was before they got to this world. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of times that's the case. And I think it leads to a interesting narrative decision where they're usually presenting the world or the character as, you know, a very, I would say, like, lacking that sort of nuance and care, because it either just says that they literally just don't care about their history, or rather it's so unimportant to the rest of the story that they could be anybody, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
yes.
Isekai in general was more of a storytelling device, as in like, oh, how we got here, as a way to insert the reader into the story than it is more as a device to tell the main character's story.
And that's kind of ironic with Subaru then, as someone who does have his history in the real world fleshed out more than typical. When we start, we don't even get that. The actual novels and source content start with him waking up, opening his eyes, and he's in the Lagunican capital. The anime gives us like 10 minutes before so, but even then it's not very much.
Yeah.
No, not at all. And I think we talked about this a little bit. I think at one point, and this is just speculation on our part, for the most part, it's just that I think Teppei initially, when he was writing the web novel at least, didn't know the structure or form or tone of the series entirely. You know? I think there was some like ironing out he had to do in his head about where he wanted the pacing and the perspective of the characters to really lie. I think he really got into that later on.
Yeah.
I think he was Subaru especially on that was definitely written more as a blank slate traditional protagonist character, at least in the super early web novel. We've discussed that during our like arc 1 and 2 live readings too.
Yes.
That it's just he's not really the character that we know and love from the light novels and from the anime nearly as much. And it probably wasn't until he was writing maybe like arc 3, arc 4 that he truly got into that and got to make the Subaru who we are familiar with. And obviously went back and adapted it. Though he did still have some unique characterization to him, especially with the self-loathing aspect of it.
Yeah.
But we kind of jumped ahead a bit.
Yes.
Tell me if you can, in as simple of a phrase as possible, describe Subaru as a child for me.
A people pleaser. How best do I put it? He's so desperate for attention and love that he will do almost anything to achieve it.
I was going for a gifted kid, but that is also true.
But yes, I guess we could go into... I guess that's actually the best place to start, the gifted angle. Subaru as a kid was a great achiever in school, socially,
athletics.
He had what a lot of kids don't have, which is talent in his early age. And everyone paid attention to him because of it. As Subaru grew up, and he got more unsure of his identity. He didn't really know who he was. I think he placed a lot of how other people see him on how people see his father.
Well, when you're being told you're definitely your father's kid for every achievement that you possibly do, it's not really another way to go about that.
No. And it leads to Subaru gaining an inferiority complex towards his own father, and it's a really tragic mental situation, I think, especially as like an only child. This is another aspect of Subaru which I think a lot of people don't really dive into. Subaru as an only child, having all these expectations placed on him, even if they're not like meant, like there's no deeper meaning behind it, but to Subaru there is, right? So when people say these things to him, especially as a child, it leaves a big impression on him. So when he feels like he's not living up to that ideal, he feels useless and he feels like he's falling behind. And I think a lot of people can relate to that level of not meeting people's expectations or how you perceive people's expectations to be, at least.
Yes. I don't think that's necessarily even his parents' expectations for him that he wasn't meeting either, because he did always have their attention. They were always focused on him. He was just so concerned with everyone outside of those two because he didn't have any... It seems like he didn't have any real meaningful relationships up until the point that he does get isekai'd. Like, he had his group of friends as an actual child, but it looks like they all left one by... It implies one by one, but that's not necessarily like actually showing that he just kept pissing one of them off.
Yeah, and you know, in Subaru's story, that's actually one of the things that I probably relate to the most. This sort of idea of like, you're well liked by everybody, but Subaru lived a life in which he was prone to exaggerating or aggrandizing himself to make people like him better, even if it's not authentic to who he wants to be. You know what I mean? He is chasing a sort of ideal that isn't he's trying to be his father, right? In any sort of situation. And because of that, people don't actually form an actual relationship with him. They form a relationship with the person that he tries to present himself to be. And we see that in the story going forward, especially in the earlier arcs, in which people don't understand what Subaru is thinking or who he actually is, because he is so inauthentic, because he's trying to become this ball of amazing charisma and energy and wit and charm that he just isn't actually affecting, people with who he actually is.
That's fair, and I completely agree that is especially what happened in his history and like growing up. I don't think it's necessarily inauthentic for him to have these different personas almost that he puts on, like masks that he has or characters and personality that he uses for different interactions and different people, because ultimately that is his character. We see that throughout the entire story, that depending on what person he's with, he acts quite differently from it. He's antagonistic and seems like the disgruntled teenage boy when he's with like Roswaal or somebody. He's a caring older brother when he's with kids, or a teaching mentor with Garfield. A super vulnerable person that you could almost say is his real self, really only with Beatrice and Rem. And with Amelia, he tries to be like the ultimate version of himself. And I think that's what he was struggling with, only going for as a kid, is wanting to present this, the best person, the one that everyone wants to be around. And he really tries that for the first time when he starts high school and decides that I'm going to completely reinvent myself here. Fresh start. Nobody knows who I am. I'm going to make a huge impression. And all he ends up doing is humiliating himself in front of the entire school.
And the impression I at least got, especially of the story, is that Subaru wasn't exactly bullied. It's just with how he introduced himself and how weird he appeared to people, because everyone could tell it was very insincere, right? Like, or at least strange.
It's strange at the very off-putting is how I would probably put it.
Yeah, you could, especially in the anime, I think it gets it across really well when you see the flashes of the other students looking at Subaru as he like introduces himself.
Mm-hmm.
You very much get the impression Subaru wasn't really bullied like a lot of other isekai protagonists, especially of his type, are. Subaru is just an outcast. No one interacts with him because of that, and I think that's quite a realistic like showing of how a lot of people like that are in school, because there are people that are bullied, and then there are also examples of people that just no one pays attention to, like the outcast, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the exact opposite reaction of not only what Subaru wanted but also needed in that moment. And I think that's what causes him to withdraw so quickly from school.
Yes, we get from his history in father and child, or parent and child, that he starts high school, and the framing of the episode makes us a little unclear, but just based on the timings and the scenery from both the first episode and that episode, it looks like he did do his first year at high school normally, and then into his second year. At some point, he missed class like once, and then that became twice, and then multiple times a week, every other day, weeks at a time. And he says it took him 3 months before he stopped going altogether.
Yeah,
I think the first point where he started playing hooky.
I think one thing, I had a bout in which I skipped school for a while, right? For similar social reasons, right?
Mm-hmm.
And really what ends up happening, and I think this is what happens to Subaru, right? Is that once it feels like it's allowed, your parents are going to try your best to get you to school no matter what, right? But because Subaru's parents
skip.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, when you're like not actually sick and you kind of just you pretend to be sick, and then they kind of relent on it, right? That type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And my guess is that it happened with Subaru in that way. It was just like, I'm gonna take a day off, and then his parents like, yeah, I'm supportive of you, son, because that's sort of the type of parents they are. And then as he said, he's like, I want you to hate me,
Yes.
Like he wanted them to yell at him, try trying to motivate him to change, to be a better person.
Well,
but I know. I'm not saying that I'm not saying that they don't want the best for their son. I'm just saying that Subaru thought that, you know, he had to be punished for the way that he is, you know, for failing, for all these different things, and he expected that.
It's also that, and this is a feeling that I do completely have in common with Subaru here, because I was skipping school in college for a very, very similar feeling of it, where he's like watching the clock in the morning, waiting for it to be too late for him to make it to class in time. Because as soon as that goes by, he says that that's typically when the anxiety feeling goes away. He's also, if it's anything like my experience, he's feeling that constantly, waiting to get past the point of no return of his parents kicking him out and forcing him to go live on his own. Because after that, he doesn't have to worry about it happening anymore. So he's deeply desiring it, but is completely so in his head that he has no idea that that's never going to happen, because his parents don't seem to care that he's not going to school. They care that he's withdrawn and doesn't want to.
Yeah. As someone that's struggled with similar issues with Subaru, like you guys all have too, and dropping out of college, like I once did it for like a whole month due to how bad my anxiety and depression was at the time. It's a very relatable situation. And I think it speaks a lot to the procrastinator in all of us, right? Where you have an anxiety about a situation, or perhaps you just really don't want to do something. And instead of just letting yourself either, one, cut it off and just be plain about it and honest about it, or two, push through it, you instead make it as inconvenient as possible, wait as long as possible, and then it's impossible to do. And that relieves some of the anxiety. But it doesn't really solve the core issue.
No, it puts it off. And the more he does it, the more Subaru just gets frustrated with himself. And we find that it's been 3 months since the last time he had gone to school. So it's been 6 months since he started playing hooky. Based on the imagery in Parent and Child, it seems like it was around springtime. So like right at the beginning of a new school year.
Yeah.
Of his second year. So he's probably stopped going close to like the end of his first year, really. And then had skipped for a decent amount of time, which puts him at the right age of 17 when he does get transitioned. And we find in Arc 2 that he actually had quite a lot of unique and strange hobbies during that time, ranging from sewing to martial arts in his bedroom to practicing with swords, working out every day, reading cell phone novels. Look those up if you didn't catch our live reads when we discussed what that was. To all just sorts of little things, but none of them quite fulfill that need he has.
Yeah.
He just hates himself more and more and more as time goes on.
You know what's interesting is that it's hard not to think about this in terms of labels, but like a lot of times people are like, you know, some of hikikomoris are traditionally depressed, right? In that sense, right? But I never got the impression that it was necessarily depression that got Subaru. I just think it was anxiety, one. But then two, like a lingering sense of like loss of identity. You know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. I think that his isolating himself and becoming a shut-in gave him depression. And during that time, he developed an anxiety disorder about it. Not that necessarily either of those are the reason he stopped going in the first place.
They're a symptom of the problem that caused it. It's not exactly the reason why it happened in the first place, though.
And I think that a new persona to take on, a new version of himself to be, until he's so withdrawn he doesn't even say the proper respectful goodbye to his mom before heading out the door the last time.
We've all had that moment where we're either too wrapped up in our head or too like, you know, just like you're going through the motions of the day and you feel kind of grumpy. And you just like either say something that sounds kind of cold to your parents, even though it makes no sense, or like you just kind of like don't say thank you when somebody holds the door open for you, and you're like, I don't usually do that. Like, why am I? Like, I just need to calm down, you know. Like everyone's had that moment, or maybe you're just too caught up, especially with people closest to you, right? Like it's easy to be nice to people who, you know, you feel like you kind of have to, but for people that know you in and out. Like it becomes harder to kind of restrain yourself from being like showing your true feelings. Like just like you're dispassionate, or you're sad, or you're upset, or you're grumpy, or you're tired, all those things.
100%. I think one of the biggest tragedies of this entire story that will never get resolved and has no way of having been undone or have any sort of happy ending is the fact that Sue's never going to be able to find him.
Maybe he'll go back one day, just for a second.
I think a really sad reality of the story is I don't think that's ever going to happen. I don't think even in a convenient small way that will happen. I think that is genuinely a loss both for Subaru and for his parents at the same time. And I think the gravity and the weight of that as a loss for both characters.
I do think necessary tragedies like that are important in stories, right?
Yeah.
I think absolutely. So. But yeah, I don't know if I heard this right, but I think Teppei has expressed interest in trying to revisit the real world at some point.
I think so. I can't say for certain. I think that was asked in a Q&A at one point, and it's one of those things where he's probably never going to rule anything completely out.
Yeah.
Because he's already gone back on some of his answers in those Q&As that he's done. Obviously, we have a whole extra arc that wasn't supposed to exist. So nothing he says that hasn't been put into a light novel or the anime can really be taken as fact. But here we arrive at the point where he does get brought to Lagunica, and just as a brief summary, who is this person that's been brought through, even if he doesn't really know himself? Like, who is Subaru at the time where he does get isekai'd over?
Someone that I think well and truly has given up on himself and on progressing himself. Someone that is apathetic and is seeing life almost like I know this is kind of very metaphorical, but like a grey movie. Like, there's no excitement to his life. There's nothing that interests him or stimulates him. There's no matter what he tries to do, he can't fulfill himself. He can't find who he is.
Yeah. I think it's one of those scenarios in which if he didn't, because he didn't take a step in a direction that led him to the real world, what happens to them, that it gets them teleported to a new world. But for Subaru, it was just, he was walking and suddenly he was in a new world. I honestly think
we're assuming. We don't actually see the point where he does move over. It just, his memories are he's leaving the convenience store and then he wakes up in Lagunica. There could have been maybe an entire loop that he's never going to remember that happens at that point.
Yeah, I'm just going by what the anime shows us.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it's like, the thing about that is, I honestly think if he did, like, if it wasn't this crazy magical, happenstance, I don't think he would ever move forward, or at least in like a whole way, to reclaim some of what he lost by doing this. I think that's the fortunate part about him getting this chance.
And this, I think, plays a little bit into the themes of the story, and why I love Subaru as a protagonist, especially as an isekai protagonist, is because a lot of the time, for a lot of isekai protagonists, just in general, this being an isekai protagonist doesn't really mean too much, right? And that's by the nature and design of the stories. That's not exactly a criticism. But for Subaru, it means a lot, right? To find out who he is, and you as the reader or watcher get to discover that along with him.
Even if he does immediately make the exact same mistake he did when he started high school.
Exactly.
The exact same opportunity. He just dives back into putting on this showy persona, and he gets mugged as a result of it this time.
Yep. I think an extra element to this as well is that Re:Zero is the perfect example of a story that shows you that in real life, change is not linear for a person.
No, it's certainly not linear.
You don't just decide to be better and then you are better. This is one of the most frustrating things I find in a lot of storytelling, especially today, where a character will decide to change and then just is that way, which is just not interesting to read or watch, and two, it's just not realistic at all to how a person
acting on it. Like, you make that New Year's resolution and you stick to it immediately. What a lot of people don't ever see or write into the characters is that regression of they can't keep it up. They fall back. And we talked a lot about that with like Ed during our Psychoculturists And Subaru at this point, I think the biggest thing we haven't really hit on establishing where we start him at the story is just how much he really does anime. Like, browse through the Arc 1 light novels, or web novels, or either one, whichever one you're able to access. He talks in his head a lot with just constant negativity and self-doubt and self-consciousness, and it's just it's awful of how often it really is in there.
It's really sad. Like, really, really sad.
But, I mean, on the bright side for him, the only place he really has to go is up. He already hates himself. There's no real worse mindset to have for him going forward for him to be able to grow and progress.
And also, I think this is the element that's most important to Subaru, at least at the time, until he learns more in Arc 4, is there's no one here that knows who Subaru or his father is. And that to Subaru is like ultimate freedom.
That is also one of his bigger limitations, though, is no one knows who he is. And it plays into one of the bigger themes of the story is the loneliness that really comes from him as a protagonist.
Yeah. I think there's also a moment in which he comes to the world. I guess we'll talk about this really quick. Where he comes to the world and he kind of sees everybody as like set dressing for his new... He's excited to claim his life, things tailored around him to... You know, he doesn't see these people as three-dimensional. I think that's something we'll talk about later, too.
I mean, it's a good point to talk about it now. He's genre savvy, too, and thinks he's in a game. He literally thinks these are all NPCs at the start.
But also, I think it goes beyond just the NPC part. It makes me wonder if in his real life he started seeing people that way, too. Like, only people that he could move around to validate himself, to validate that he is like his father, you know, instead of like people that he needs to get to know and actually form deep relationships with and understand that they're nuanced and complex. I think that's something that even in the ReZero world he had to learn, you know, the way they saw Amelia, the way they saw, you know, the maid sisters, the way they saw Beatrice, the way they saw everybody, you know, there was a learning curve on his understanding that these people were more than just...
Turn by Death is like the perfect tool to teach a character empathy. I think for Subaru in particular, he's so thing that held him back in the old world and at the start of the story itself.
He does to an extent, but it's not like it's not putting himself really in their shoes fully. He's like, it's almost standing where they're standing is like what Subaru does with these people. He doesn't imagine what they're feeling. He thinks of what he would be feeling if he were in their position.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I would be so annoyed if someone came up to me and started doing the things I'm doing. Or they're clearly being suspicious of me because I would be suspicious in this case. It's an incredibly selfish mindset that he's got about it.
And I think a very common thing for teenage boys around his age to feel, and the way they see the world, right?
Mm-hmm. You're just starting able to piece things together. You might actually be the one who's in the right for the first time and know things that someone else doesn't know, and it starts to feed into your head of, I'm always right. I obviously know the way things work. I understand everything. I can never be wrong.
People often think that to have an ego, you have to like yourself. But actually, hating yourself so much is usually a symptom of having a big ego.
Yes.
You're conflating that everything revolves around you. People must think that, you know, I'm so lame. People must think that I'm awful. Usually people don't really think that much about other people in particular, unless it's, you know, love or whatever, or obsession. Yeah. But yeah, like that type of thing is the truth. Like he had such a big ego. We see it with Amelia later on. There's this sort of idea that, you know, you get wrapped up in yourself, and self-hatred is usually about you having a big ego. So yeah, learning more empathy, as you said, is a big part of his journey here.
So he's lacking empathy. He's lacking any meaningful connections. He's lacking an identity. Exactly. Thank you. He's lacking any agency as well. We didn't really touch on that, but in the point where he's brought in, he can't do anything. He can't read. He can't buy anything. He has no place to sleep, no place to stay, no one to talk to. He's alone, and he's weak. Yes. And you mentioned Return by Death, and that's a great segue into our next kind of major talking point. And that's what Subaru can do. Like, what are his skills and strengths, his actual powers? And for some of the spoilers, and we'll have some indication of when to come back for that as well and start the next piece.
Yes. Okay. He dies. He returns to a specific point in time with no delay. No
conscious delay.
Yeah, no conscious delay. Which I think is maybe something a bit difficult for a lot of people to kind of imagine how that would feel, like how disorienting and confusing that would feel. Because you see this sometimes, I think, in a lot of... I've watched a lot of reactions to ReZero because I love React content. I think it's really interesting hearing what other people feel about stuff that I love. And I think a lot of people get frustrated with Subaru, especially in Arc 1, where he doesn't immediately realise, oh, I'm dying. Oh, I'm repeating this. His brain is so confused and traumatized by what is happening to him throughout these loops that it takes him a while to knock into his noggin that this is real. This is
here. And this is more cut content for everyone at home here as well. But on the topic of it being an instant moment, which is obviously incredibly disorienting and hugely impactful, especially because all the physical shift isn't there yet. So he wakes up and there's an instant huge rush of adrenaline that's going to make his heart race and put him into an even worse position than he may have necessarily died in if it was a surprise. But the truth is, there is some time between where we kind of get into the more hidden powers that Return by Death is really involved into that I don't want to fully explain now. But just know it is deeper than just snap his fingers, reset, and I encourage you to read the source material if you want more in depth on that. It might get touched on here in Season 3 coming up. I expect that if it's going to happen then. But it's deeper than that. But on the broad, a lot of his different personality aspects here. Like, for one, it's obvious, I think, just phenomenal writing on Tappei's part.
It thematically, it's wonderful in terms of seeing Subaru's progression as a character and him always, whenever he's at the worst point in his story, is when he thinks of Return by Death as a tool.
It's also the worst episode of the series.
But whenever Subaru is aware that Return by Death is a curse, it's a burden, it's something that is forbidden. It should not
shouldn't be used.
Be in human hands. It should not be used.
When it gets to this point, especially in the coming season of the anime, right? They'll be like, why does he care so much about not dying, right? Like, things are going bad. He could just, he could try to go again and not have, be hurt or be, have somebody else be hurt, right? And the truth is, he learned that he has to value his life and everybody else's lives more, right? Because in real life, other people don't have the curse that Subaru does, right? So, he is realizing that it's not normal to think in the way, like, Subaru is...
It's demented.
It's demented. It's, like, inhuman, right? We'll get to that later. Yeah. Like, the fact that he has to think... He has to separate himself from thinking like a witch, right? As you said, like a warlock or whatever the translation might be. But, like, the idea that, like, I could use this to, be above everybody else. He has to ground himself and not be taken by this immense power that he's gifted with.
Yeah, it's his life. It just deserves to be saved just as much as anyone else's. It should be obvious to him. And not even the inhuman witches can understand why it wasn't. That he was weaponizing this curse where it's meant to save him. It's not meant to empower him.
Yes. It's a defensive tool. It's not an offensive tool, right?
And this as he uses it. Sorry, go ahead.
I think that what I love really about the genre savviness of this story is not only does it play isekai in terms of like discussing that as a trope and genre, which I think is really interesting. I think a lot of people don't really talk about this. It discusses this sort of looping time story a bit too, because in a lot of other looping time stories, it's like the ultimate gift, and a lot of characters you don't see a lot of the mental and psychological effects that would genuinely take on a person, and instead you see them use it as a weapon offensively, and like do stuff that is super strange or weird because they really desperately are going to use this power to min-max their life, right?
Right.
Whereas Subaru, his whole identity and story is learning that you shouldn't be doing that shit, even if you have the ability to do it.
It's, there's a point where Subaru does get pushed to needing to weaponize it, of it being like, I've lost someone, I have to go back and redo it. Notably, both times, it has been Rem who he's lost that he needed to actively kill himself to redo, but that's neither here nor there. But in either of those cases, he doesn't learn anything. Neither of those deaths help him avoid the next death at all. It's just a purely... it's almost a selfish maneuver to do. It's greedy, is how Roswaal describes it. To restart at that point when he had the opportunity to keep going, even if he had to deal with the grief of it. And that's something that I don't think he still has moved past the mindset of using, especially with the sword of Damocles hanging over his head of Roswaal killing everybody if he doesn't save everyone.
And we won't talk about this too in-depthly because it's a very touchy subject, but I very much being ultimately a very tragic and selfish thing, right? Like it's not productive towards Subaru's development as a character, right?
No, it doesn't help him. And that's the whole trade-off in season 2, is he going to try and use it to help him at the cost of kind of everything he is and everything he ever will be, every chance he has, every breath he takes, and everything else that Echidna describes,
because
of losing it all,
I think,
just to make things work out.
In terms of like thematics and like, there is really only one thing that connects all mortal people in stories, and that is death. Like, ultimately, everyone's will have a different experience in life, but everyone will one day face death if you're mortal, right? Subaru having this ability, it in some ways warps his perception of his own humanity.
At least for a while.
Yeah. And it's a scary prospect, and one that I think...
Yeah, because the most human trait that he has to always cling to, because this is the most human trait in all of us, is our shared understanding that we're all going to die. If you take that away from somebody, then they become something other than human.
Well, look at the only other character we really have that's gone beyond like life and death as a human person, and how much of a monster it really turned them into with Roswaal.
Yeah.
Like, he's been escaping death for 400 years, just jumping from body to body. And it's left him as inhuman. It literally describes him almost to the point of being like a warlock to the level of Hector. But we've touched on Return by Death here a decent amount, and we could probably spend an entire hour talking about it if we really needed to.
Our own podcast episode on Return by Death in particular.
But his next ability that we uncover, even if he has lost it at this point, is his yin magic, his shadow magic, and the one spell he can cast with it. So Subaru as a character is someone that's able to pick up on kind of anything, even if he's not like a master of any of it, but very much a jack of all trades. And he does end up with the one power and ability to use magic, and is able to pick it up pretty quickly, even though that because he's not familiar with this world, he wasn't born there, it doesn't work correctly. He hasn't worked that muscle properly throughout his life, even if it's the super rare shadow magic that, again, is another more interesting, in that it's only debuffs, meaning that these powers, these spells that he has, only work and will only work if he has someone else there to take advantage of that. It doesn't help him as an individual. It doesn't give him a weapon.
It's similar to Return by Death. It's a reactive power, right?
I mean, he does use it actively rather than reactively, but yes.
But by its nature, it's reactive. Like, you have to use it.
It's a transformative power.
Yeah.
It gives what's it called? Transmutes something to something else, you know? Using the fact that you can, you know, relive your life. You know, you use that as you wish. Information you might get, you know, being able to grasp something, you know, stuff like that. It's all just utility, you know.
Mm-hmm. It gives him more options, not necessarily makes him more powerful. And that's something I think a lot of maybe people who are critical of Subaru as a weak character, like physically, that is, in terms of combat prowess, are missing, is that he's never going to be that hero. That's what Reinhardt exists for. That's what, like, all of the villains show off, that when they take that one limited utility that they have and push it to an extreme, it makes them a monster. Subaru's powers are all meant to reflect who he is as a person, different parts of his character, whether they're flaws or highlights of them, and make them easier to work with someone else. It gives him a high compatibility with Beatrice, someone who does know how to take his shadow magic and turn it offensive. It allows him to give others the chance to escape. It brings him to the point where he needs to stay and rest and recover and give that space that's necessary. Even if he doesn't see it as a benefit at the time, him using Shamak against Julius is the reason he has to stay in the capital. All the way up until needing to burn it in order to, like, completely give that up in order to beat Garfield at that point. He's sacrificing this one power he has for an ally to gain there. I think that's a nice, useful tool. And the fact that that's when he loses it specifically is such a perfect moment, because the one spell he knows how to use with it is Shamak, a spell that's by definition isolating and lonely. It's meant to isolate someone, the weakest form just blinding them, and the most advanced literally locking them in an alternate dimension. And that is permanently.
One of my favorite scenes in the anime is the moment initially that Puck casts Shamak to show it to Subaru, and you see these couple of seconds of Subaru being isolated by the spell, and him screaming and panicking in this, like, abyss. And it really speaks, I think, to the loneliness of his character. And it's why it's really appropriate that of all the spells he gets while he gets to use it, it's a spell that confines.
It isolates, it locks them away. It keeps them separated out. And so long as he's using it, that's what he uses it for. He uses it to sacrifice himself against the Olgarm. He uses it to try and get the upper hand and go against everyone's wishes against Julius. He tries to use it to be the hero and sacrifice his life against Elsa. And the only time it actually works correctly is when he's using it just to get an advantage to help in this scenario. And I think
convince somebody else.
Exactly. And the fact that his shadow magic turns into something that's much more usable, which, again, we'll see more in Season 3 of how far he's able to take it with Beatrice. But at the very least, Minya, just as this moment of frozen time, you gave up the power, quote-unquote, of being lonely for your companions. You need to stay with Beatrice to keep using it. But Gold, you mentioned the grasping for his next power that we see that he's gotten in the anime. Which is invisible providence.
Oh yes, that's what he calls it. Yeah, I mean, I think the parallels or the allusions are pretty clear here, right? So obviously we're getting over all of his powers that he gets from these witch factors. I'm trying to think if there's any interesting parallels between him and Beetlejuice in my head real quick. Not really.
Probably not that we can go over right now, because the parallels in, like, what that his version of the unseen hand versus Betelgeuse's really isn't shown yet.
Yeah, I was about to say, yeah, it's true. I was going to ask if I could talk about that, but yeah, So the unseen hand's interesting because, as you know, we're grasping for things. Hand imagery, do you think that he held Beatrice's hand, like his level of power with this unseen thing might be more than just the physical. Like, do you think that it's just a punchy power, right? Or do you think that he's going to use it to assist people like he always does? That's sort of the vibe that you have to be thinking alongside his powers.
Yeah, the punch was weaker than just Patrichet running into Garth.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's obviously not the strongest. It's a sneak attack for sure.
Yeah.
But,
But also, if he uses it that way, it fucks him up. Like, the whole reason he collapses after the fight with Garfield in Season 2 is because he uses it. Not because he's getting beat down.
Yeah, and obviously Betelgeuse using it. I mean, Betelgeuse had to injure himself to spawn more and more hands. He was biting his fingers, ripping out his hair, scratching his face. Yeah, it was clearly like a heavy, heavy cost to it.
It seems like a painful power, and it's interesting because he is a bad fit for Sloth in a sense.
Yeah, Echidna had to intervene to make sure that it didn't screw up.
Yeah. So that might be a part of it, right? Same with Beetlejuice, Betelgeuse. Juice.
The original Juice was not compatible either.
Exactly. He wasn't really compatible either, the original one. And you can tell because of his harping about Sloth. It's not, when a character, as an Archbishop, starts cursing their sin, we see Gluttony love his sin.
He literally gorges in it and imbibes in it, and
so it's perfect for him, right? And then we see people like Regulus, who denies the existence of his sin,
but still embodies it.
But embodies it perfectly, right? And then we see Beetlejuice curse his slothfulness all the time, so much that he's self-harming himself when he sees allusions to his own shortcomings, right? That is the same way I think Subaru has a lack of affinity with this unseen hand as far as its power goes, right?
At least its source.
Yeah, where it is drawn from, right? This sort of negative emotion of being lazy. Because I think Subaru, ever since, he tried to give up with Rem, he's wanted to throw that part of it himself away, as far away as possible.
I wonder if he had gotten the Sloth Witch Factor in one of the loops before episode 18. Like, if they had managed to slay Betelgeuse, like, in the second time he goes for him. Like, when he's asking all the candidates for help, if they had managed to go and hunt him down and slay him. If his unseen hand would have been much stronger because he was wanting to take the easy route and try and give up at that point.
I think it
would
have
Or at least go the lazy route of asking somebody else to do it.
I genuinely think it would have been. Because I think we see this as an example of Betelgeuse, right? Where he uses it because it's... When he uses it, it's a tragic situation, right? He uses it, and when he first absorbs the witch factor, as we see in Season 2, he uses it to protect someone, defend someone, because he feels like that's his only option. But the more he uses the power, the more it becomes an easy crutch for him to stand on, right? It's his way of manifesting power. And so I think the true slothfulness that powers Betelgeuse's unseen hands, and what makes him so weak is obviously him not truly being a slothful person, but he has more sloth than Subaru because he's allowed this power to be his crutch. So when Subaru inherits it and gets his own like imagining of what that power would be, it's a single hand that I think rather interestingly thematically comes out of his chest instead of his back as well.
Yeah, it's in front of him, something that he's reaching for instead of like coming from behind him.
Yeah, so it grounds Subaru more. It makes him more diligent, almost, in the sense of... Because you get this in some of the novels too, which a lot of anime-only watchers may not fully, like, grasp how, like, the feeling feels when Subaru uses this unseen hand. He literally feels like there's this black curse running through his veins whenever he uses it. Like this ultimate despair and hopelessness, and like this true evil, like blackness in his heart. And I think it really speaks to the idea of how truly sinful these witch factors of sin are, right?
Yeah, it's a foulness within him. It's no coincidence that it looks very similar to the same hand that Satella uses to grip his heart.
Yes.
Like, it's not the same thing. Anyone who's anime only and was thinking that. That's not the same hand. The difference is hers is, like, clawed and wiggly, and his is very clean lines and wrapped around and looks like his hand extended out. Although, for whatever reason, I think Puck also said Satella could spawn 1,000 of them. I think that's probably just, like, a translation thing. That it may not have directly meant those.
Yeah.
But regardless, this is our first of the witch factors that Subaru's gotten. We'll have to see if he hunts down the other archbishops successfully and starts collecting them. I don't think we really need to dive into the others necessarily here, especially because they haven't been shown in the anime yet.
I personally think we'll dedicate our own episodes to them.
Probably
filled with spoilers for people that want to avoid. If they
one of them, I think will definitely wait until it becomes super relevant in an upcoming podcast to talk about.
Yes.
But from here, then, with kind of his powers and the way that they reflect the aspects of his characters, whether it's like the unseen hand, invisible providence, which, while it does show this former part of him, it is also a sign of his victory, like of his success, is that he has overcome this entirely and is now able to use his past hurt for himself. Was the last thing I wanted to hit on that.
Oh, one last thing I'll mention about invisible providence now I think about before we move on. He calls it invisible providence because he imagines it as the providence of God. And I think it's really important to mention this with this power in particular, because Subaru's only way of using this power effectively without literally destroying his soul is imagining it as like almost a miracle, almost like something that's used to help and to nurture. Because when Subaru punches Garfield, he's punching Garfield to help him.
And even then, it still hurts.
And even then, it still hurts him. So I think it's really important to note that the way Subaru maintains this power and doesn't let it consume him, as it did Betelgeuse, is by almost imagining it in this metaphorical hand of God sort of way, which I think is kind of interesting.
It is also, I think, mechanically in lore now tied to the envy witch factor that Satella's using on him, just based on how Echidna was describing what she used the tea for. But that's probably just diving too deeper than maybe even the authors thought of it.
Yeah.
But, like, we've touched on where he started. We've touched on what the powers are and kind of how they represent to him. What about his lack of power here? Like, we don't really dive too deep into just how weak he is. But I believe, according to the author, Subaru is the second physically weakest character in the series. Or at least adult male character in the series.
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting and I think really cool decision for him to make Subaru, our protagonist, our hero, a character that's main strength is his leadership and his ingenuity rather than his physical prowess.
Yeah, because a conflict is like a cool spectacle, like a fight, right? But a story really comes from people and relationships and circumstances, right? So focusing in on that more so with your main character than the fighting aspect of A New World really strengthens the tone of the show. And the show or the book or whatever, it is at many times many different things. All of it high drama. We got mystery stuff, we got fantasy stuff, we got character drama. That is it foremost. If you're expecting an action sort of whimsical fantasy thing, this is not the same. He's not the same character. So I think that was a decision that he pretty much put his foot down on immediately with this decision of making Subaru weak. You know, I think that sort of thing was such an interesting slant angle, and it takes a lot of will to resist being like, and then my main character is the coolest guy ever, you know, and being able to say, no, it's actually more interesting if he's not, right? Or it's more interesting when a character fails or is bad or, you know, does the wrong decision, because that is what life is all about, right?
Exactly. It would also give him like almost a cheat or a skip ahead in his own character development if he did develop some amazing, like ridiculously great power. Because then all the reasons that he doesn't like himself, or the self-doubt, self-loathing, anxiety he has about his ability and who he is as a person, don't have to be resolved naturally and through hard work. He can just accept, oh, I've got a superpower now. I don't have to worry about it anymore. I'm now awesome. And then he misses the actual growth that would come from the development to that.
And you mentioned Reinhardt earlier as an example of an opposing like hero figure to Subaru's own heroism. And I actually want to talk, I guess, in the sense of that Subaru is the embodiment of an average person working hard to meet the level of people that are insanely talented and have insane levels of privilege to back up that talent and build them up, right? Mm-hmm. Like, Subaru is someone that has to fight his way to the table. He's not invited there.
Yeah. Definitely. He has to climb those ladders. He has to make it to the top on his own merit. And that comes in like almost every aspect of who he is as a weak person does have a foil to it, showing the complete extreme of it. Subaru's not a good knight. Here's Julius. Subaru's not a super-powered hero. Here's Reinhardt. He's not the master, hyper-genius magic master. Here's Roswaal. He's not the person that Amelia adores the most. Here's Puck. It's just so many other characters that show what he wants to be, and like what he has to strive and work towards. And even they aren't complete and like perfect people. They all have their own flaws. They all have their own other issues. And sometimes Subaru has a leg up on one of them in a different field. Even if he is only stronger than Felix physically. Who is malnourished and weak and has no testosterone in his entire body.
Yeah, I think from a thematic standpoint, it's really cool to see a character that is the literal ultimate underdog. I think the genius of this story and the genius of Tappei writing Subaru as a protagonist the way he has is it makes Subaru the ultimate underdog. There's always stakes in the story. Even in the nature of Subaru's power of return by death, there is tension and stakes, and people are invested in like Subaru's well-being and Subaru's progression as a person and Subaru helping other people. And it's really, really like interesting and fulfilling. It posits like interesting challenges. Like Subaru's always challenged in the story. I find a lot of this isn't even just related to isekai stories, but a lot of main character stories, and in particular in a lot of modern fantasy stories I find are more the embodiment of an idea, of like an archetype of like, oh, I'm a hero, so I boom boom smack everything and it gets done and it's all solved. But that's not interesting. I don't want to see that. I want to see someone really earn their progression. And Subaru does that.
And you know what? I was thinking about this. We've talked about this before, about what isekai is and what what we like about ReZero. But like, when you really think about it, an isekai that has its main character teleport into the world and then get stronger just because they teleport into that world, they aren't the same character. This isn't the actual escapist fantasy, because if we're talking about like this sort of escapism, you would need to be the same person in your previous world as you are in your in this new fantasy world. And Subaru is the exact same person that he was. And I think that's something that people miss in their heads about what makes escapism and the sort of like, rooting for a fantasy character and relating to them so valuable. it's when you realize that they're just like you. And I think that's what Subaru has in spades. And as you said, Connor, all the other characters serves as foils to what is needed for Subaru to develop, as well as being their own characters in their own right. But it really shows the careful understanding and great, narrative writing that Teppei is so great at with the story. That makes it so robust and so, strong with Subaru at the helm and so compelling.
And I think at the end of the day, Subaru is a great protagonist for a lot of teenage boys or young adult men in his sort of situation, or not even in his direct backstory situation. Just the feeling of, who am I? What am I going to mean to the world and the people around me? Because that is Subaru's constant struggle in this story, of understanding who is Natsuki Subaru. Because he doesn't know yet. And we don't know who he'll be at the end of the story yet. We're going to make some guesses shortly. But
I think we lost the episode, but I think we got a hint of who he could be at the end.
Exactly,
with,
and we'll make reference
from
to
EX1.
Yeah, I will definitely be making reference to that later on. But all is to say, I think what makes this story like magic in a bottle is the genuine idea of Subaru struggling with his identity, and each arc of the story is him figuring out a tiny piece of who he is, but not being able to place it in this puzzle, so he still doesn't know. And it's fantastic character writing. It's so engaging.
Yeah. So where do we think he's going with that then? If he's starting out as weak as he is, he's gotten the powers that he has, and I mean, obviously he's working towards self-improvement and not hating himself. But what does that really mean for him as a character at the end? Where is his arc going to go? We obviously still have to really explore his ability to, say, be the leader of the group now that he's properly formed one, to understand who he is and what he's accomplished and start to see good in himself, the different identities he takes on and the reasons he has for that. But even beyond those, where's this going? Who is Subaru going to be at the end?
This is in general just I think he'll be a little king. I think Subaru's greatest strength, and I think where his calling will end up being, is leadership. Because Subaru is really good at uniting people and leading people. Subaru is a really good example of someone that can put people in the right place and have total faith in them, and because of his undying level of determination and his just ability to win people over and that charm he has, I think he really will be leading into that sort of leadership, heroic sort of figure. As Connor mentioned earlier, we unfortunately lost our episode on our deep dive to EX1, which I'm sure we will do a rework of eventually, because it's a fantastic book that we need to talk about. But one of the major characters in that story, Faria, is what's known as the Lion King. He's like this, and he ultimately is this embodiment of charisma and leadership and helping others and empathy, and he's literally a guiding light of just goodness. And I think that's the sort of figure and heroic image Subaru will eventually become.
And I'm not even saying that Subaru is going to not be capable of, fighting or leading people into battle or defeating great evils. But what I am saying is that, as you said, Wolf, he's going to be the little king. I think him as a quote-unquote king and leader, where he really shines is fighting the little battles that other people have inside themselves, because he has to fight them every single time he goes on a loop. Every single time that he dies and resets and starts over, he has to battle with himself, and he's battled with himself his entire life, which means that he's capable of helping other people fight their battles. I think that's the profound sort of empathy and profound sort of love for life that the story tries to convey through Subaru, where he starts to learn to care for everybody, no matter how, flawed or confusing or complex other people are. I think that's who he champions, everybody, their past and the future, and trying to make them who they want to be. I think that's really what makes him so inspiring, and how I think that he's going to end up as a hero in the future.
Almost like a true sage, eh?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Watch your references, Wolf. I've got a couple now. You're towing some lines. It's interesting that you bring that up, Gold, because I think that's actually something that Subaru doesn't have to grow into. I think that, in particular, him being able to help those around him fight those little battles is something he's always been good at, and just not realize that he is good at that.
I think that's the true part of his identity. I think that's the most true part of himself that's always been there. You know, I think that's the one that he was scared to foster, that he didn't know how to, or was scared to, or felt powerless to, right? He felt always second fiddle to other people, you know? And I think that through these experiences, he's let that show in the right opportune times. And that's always been his saving grace, and everybody else's saving grace when he does do it. And I think that really is what makes him motivational as a hero. And as you said, a little king.
I think the really cool aspect of this is to think about it in the sense of that Subaru's heroism is actually a foil to some of the heroism of the other heroic characters in the story. Because as we see in Arc 4 in the anime, Reinhard, a hero is all you'll ever be. A hero that can only fight to save someone. Subaru is way more a character focused on saving someone almost from themselves, but not in like a selfish or like fucked up sort of way, like in a genuine encourage people to be their own strength and encourage them to be who they are, because Subaru knows the struggle of not being himself or not living up to his own image of himself.
He reaches his hand down to help someone pull themselves out of the hole. He doesn't go down and lift them out or get rid of the problem entirely for them. He's someone that empowers them, whether through using his own powers or just saying the right words at the right time to a girl that really needed to hear it, to help them help themselves.
And genuinely, that's how you could be a hero in real life. I think it's really cool how Tappei has circled that back in thematic. Like, Subaru's, he's just being what a hero in real life would be. Someone that's there for people, that has empathy and helps. And whilst I think we discussed a bit of the lack of empathy Subaru had at the start of the story, I still think that there was a hidden nugget there that really, like, of who he really was, just hidden under the depression and the anxiety and the struggles of identity. I think Subaru was always an empathetic person. He just didn't allow himself to be because of how wrapped up in the world his own world he was.
I think it's like his potential for all things, and that he had the potential to be incredibly empathetic, and at this point, he has lived up to it. He is a very empathetic person by the end of season 2. But, I mean, you look at his point where he starts at the mansion, I think it's hard to find any real empathy there yet. Like, nothing genuine, at the least.
Yeah, it's definitely plasticky, you know. He's acting like an action figure character, you know. He's striking poses and he's saying funny one-liners, you know.
Quoting dating sim visual novels. He's trying to be what he imagines an empathetic person to be. And that kind of circles back to what we talked about at the beginning of him putting on this inauthentic version of himself that eventually becomes an authentic version of himself. He's going to become the hero that Rem wants him to be, because he's going to almost actualize it. He's going to be there for Emilia and become Emilia's knight. He's going to be not that person, but the one that Beatrice chooses to go with. I don't know if he's going to be king. I think that's my disagreeing point of where.
Oh, no, I don't mean it literally.
I don't mean in a literal sense. I mean king of his own kingdom, whatever that kingdom ends up being. Not like in a literal land.
Because when you really think about it, everybody becomes. I mean, a lot of people like become kings of sorts. You know, whether it's something that they author themselves, or they run themselves, or business, or whatever. You know, that's the sort of idea that I mean when I say little king.
Not like Aragorn, chosen one sort of king he's the real king all along sort of shit. Do you know what I mean? I don't think Subaru's going to play that role in the story. I think it's more the the ideal of someone that's a true leader. Because he may not be in that top dog position, but I think he fulfills that for a lot of people. That's what I mean.
Before we move on to kind of the next part of today's episode, I'll just ask you two this real quick. Do you think Subaru is going to have a truly happy ending?
Yes.
Yeah, I do.
I'm not so sure. I think it's probably going to be more bittersweet. Something that he has grown enough to accept the not perfect parts of his outcome.
Honestly, I would assume that, but then I think of this entire story, and there's been a lot of peril, obviously. There's a lot of the idea that there's people that'll triumph, you know? Like, I've never once failed in their objective yet. You know, there's people that are, like, teetering on the edge of failing. But
fulfilling ending for Subaru. As we get closer to the end of the story, Pei has been sending his message across, at least to how I've interpreted it. I think Subaru's going to have a happy ending.
And you know, I'll say this. I said yes really quickly, but what I mean is everybody can have a happy ending that in real life looks fraught with awful things. Like, no doubt Subaru's going to go through a lot of awful things. And, you know, some people that he loves might get hurt permanently. You know, just like what happened with Rem. It might not be something that he can fix with a death. You know, I think he's going to have ups and downs. And I think at the end, though, he'll feel fulfilled that he knows that he's done the best that he can, as well as the world's at a better place with him around. Or that he was there to help and save and nurture the world.
Yeah, you hit on what I was going to say to cap it off. Was I think he was going to sit there satisfied that the world was a better place with him around, almost verbatim.
And genuinely, especially as I've been reading ahead in the story, I think Subaru is genuinely a person that makes the world better by being in the world.
All right, well, that's it. Of what are Subaru's flaws? Both the ones that are dynamic and work for the character. And even if we've got some critiques of him, like an actual flaw with his writing or just with him as a person that might just be distasteful to us.
Who wants to go first? I can go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I actually talk about this a lot, and it might be something that I don't know if I've talked about before on a podcast yet, but one of the things that I always think about is what the sins mean narratively, right? And I have this idea that this is everything. This is sort of DePay's conceptualization of what everybody battles within themselves as a human, right? Like all of these like evil people, right? Like these evil attributes that people can embody, right? And that they're, you know, obviously Subaru's opponents. Like the big evils that we see in the story so far all have the name of the Seven Deadly Sins. I think that we're going to see Subaru face each one of them down to the last. And I think each one of them, it is something that will always be there, but something that can be there. And I think that is something that we all have to accept about Subaru, whether it's, as we talked about a little bit earlier, the sloth in him, wanting to run away from his issues, whether it's the greed in him with we see Echidna, this sort of idea that he wants to grasp onto everything. You know, he wants to have it all. He wants to have the perfect day without any sacrifices while still getting the perfect romantic ending that he wants with the people that he loves. Like all these things sort of incorporate in him and makes you wonder and question, does it matter that he has all the selfish qualities to him? Or is it fine in moderation? Or is it a true flaw that he needs to weed out? Like, how does anybody balance these? Like, sort of the sloth was a bad part, but was a lot of the greed a bad part? I mean, he triumphed in the end, even though he had these greedy, like, ideas and notions.
I mean, sloth, even to a point, that whole arc gets kicked off by Subaru acting when he shouldn't have acted. So even then, there is some merit to not always being like diligent and proactive.
Yeah,
for something.
Yeah. There's a practicality to slothfulness sometimes.
This is something to mention. I think Subaru and the sort of like thematic way DePay is going to be writing him through these sins and work hard to make it a virtue. So his selfishness, his greed, he's going to turn that in a way to help others, to be selfless in his own selfishness. I think example, like, again, slothfulness. He's gonna learn when he's allowed to be slothful. Because I think for a lot of the time, Subaru is a pretty good embodiment of a pacifistic character.
Absolutely.
As someone that
he
loves...
does not want to risk any violence happening when it's not necessary.
Yeah, exactly. Of someone that loves, and that's his sloth of love, of passivity, right? In that sense, is that how I embody his virtue of sloth, like its opposing idea of his diligence. He works hard to make sure that people can be slothful. You know, we don't need to fight no wars. We can just chill and talk about stuff and have a good time. Do you know what I mean?
Even then, you can't. I mean, there's not going to be a way that you can find like a virtue out of every sin. But all of the 7 plus 2 that we're working with in this story at the moment, of the sins that exist, are something that exists to a degree in every single person. Yeah. No one is without any of them entirely. Like that's kind of the whole aspect of it, though. Is Subaru is going to have to overcome these issues, and some of them he has to like a minor degree, up to certain points, and some of them he's already just decided, I'm going to embrace this and accept it about myself.
Yeah, like how much lust have we seen from Subaru? He's not really
in the canon story, not nearly as much.
In the web novel, different story.
Yeah.
Yes, different.
But that's what I mean. It's interesting that that's the case, though, right? Mm-hmm. I've always thought that. But yeah, like honestly, like there's parts of it that aren't a good fit. Like how much I don't know how to explain this. I don't know how much Subaru, and we can talk about this because it's actually interesting talking about his negative qualities. Do you think Subaru is an envious person?
Absolutely.
Yes.
100% he is.
Completely 100%. That's why his first superpower is envy.
Yep. If he attained the envy witch factor, I don't think he would even notice that he got it.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that's
so good at it.
Because genuinely, a lot of his... Because think of it like this. In our own world and through a lot of Catholic theology, the true original deadly sin is pride. Or vanity in pre-canon.
I think it is still ultimately all comes from the concept of pride, which in the Christian mythology of that is equating yourself to God. It's putting you on that level.
Whereas almost in the mythology of this universe with how the Witch of Envy works, it's almost like envy.
Think about that there is currently no Archbishop of Pride.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no Archbishop of Envy because that's where Subaru is coming from. That's his starting point as like the original goal to overcome, as he does have this feeling of being envious of who his father is, of the kind of person he could become, of everyone else in the world.
Of Julius, of Reinhard.
Exactly, of every character and what they have with someone else. But the matter of pride is, for one, I mean, that's the first If story that was written, of like Subaru overcoming that. But there's no Archbishop of it right now, at least not that the cult is aware of. It's entirely possible that that is the end point, is whoever is this personification of pride, whether it's like an alternate Subaru somehow, or even though it's been mentioned in the anime, just for spoiler's sake, being perhaps the personification or holder of that witch factor as the...
Yeah. I guess we can kind of theorize, just in general, people watching too, like, does that mean that by Subaru uniting these sins and turning his weaknesses into strength of the story?
It could be. Maybe that by the point he's towards the end, he starts getting like incredibly full of himself and too self-confident, and like everything that he was going and faking at the beginning have become the actual flaws of the character.
I could see that.
I could genuinely think that is what's going to happen. I think pride will be the last major thematic sin that he tackles in the story, specifically because of what we see in the third trial for Amelia.
Yeah, absolutely.
I genuinely think Subaru is going to make big mistakes near the end of the story that people are going to be unhappy.
Or he'll go mad with power.
Or risk going mad and kind of see that as a possibility to go forward, and has to accept that he's not the right one to do something, and like really come to terms with, I can't say maybe it's be Amelia's husband and rule the kingdom because it's going to damage her ability to do so, or he can't be the one that goes and kills Satella or stops her or welcomes her in. Or maybe it's just that he can't save her, that he gets to that end point and he cannot, with all the power he's gotten, he thinks that he's this hero at this point, that he is able to resolve this. He's fixed the kingdom, resolved the royal selection, but there's just no way to help Satella, and he has to overcome the fact that he's not able to do that.
Yeah, the idea that he has to tarnish his own idea of being a hero, you know,
or just
like that's the pride that he has, because that's the opposite of being prideful, being humble, right? The idea that he has to live down his own expectations of himself for the greater good of everyone else.
After spending like the entire series building up his expectations and love of himself.
I genuinely think, especially of how it's written in terms of how Invisible Providence and like the curse of that and Return by Death itself affects him in almost like a madness sense. As he collects these more sins, I can genuinely see Subaru start kind of being influenced by them. Like,
there's
seep into his personality, into his soul. Even like that blackness, and I think that might be the thing he has to confront last.
I think that's exactly where we're going to go, and that kind of hits his major flaws. And we kind of discussed some of the other narrative ones early on with like where he started, and they kind of shift and change each season. And I don't really want to get into where he's at the end of season 2 or where he'll be at the end of season 3 for spoiler purposes. So let's hit on some critiques of him as a character. Like anything that jumps out at you, and we'll try and stick to the canon Subaru, because there's a lot to complain about with web novel Subaru.
Yeah, if main things that come to mind in terms of critiques of Subaru as a character is web novel Subaru. I think one thing I can mention at least, I think it would be nice if we saw a bit more of Subaru's thoughts in terms of him, like after he's dealt with something, like after a major arc, we actually get to like see some of his feelings and maybe even direct regrets a bit more. Because I think one thing ReZero has done a really good job of is its pacing and like how it's going. But I think sometimes slowing it down a bit to do that would be a bit nice.
Yeah, there's a pacing issue that I find only pertains with Subaru, in that when there's a new scenario set up or the status quo changes, we either see him completely panic, fall apart, and collapse and have to rely on someone else to pick him out of this, or he immediately perfectly adapts to the scenario and just accepts it and moves on. Presents only those two things really happening. We don't ever get to see him in like the situation and examine or even react to how something has shifted and consider it. We just see him, like, immediately after that. As an example, he finds out Roswaal has been behind everything in Season 2. Behind absolutely everything. He just got out of the Tea Party, and he has no way to make Roswaal, like, go back on it. He's completely collapsed and failed. Collapsed, cries in the woods, and saying, like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Otto comes, talks him through that panic moment, but then we jump to after he has like come to terms with what all is going on and piece it all together. And it works for that pacing beat of the episode, but as the whole story, I think there's
the thing is, right, I've rewatched the season so many times. I've always thought that was almost unnecessary, almost like the freaking out that Roswaal was the one who put him in this corner, right? Was like, and he's been masterminding this forever, right? Like everything was like a great reveal. Like I love that reveal, obviously, and the voice actor killed it in that scene. It was just really dramatic. But I also thought that like everything they needed to overcome was pretty much almost all there. You know what I mean? Like with the Satella confrontation, and then okay, you're good now. Yeah, sorry. Like, and then Kinna's like, yep, my bad. And then he goes and he's like, okay, Roswaal, I'm ready. No more nonsense. Yeah, I'm ready, right? Mm-hmm. And then Roswell's like, yeah, I am as evil as you think I am. I'm even more evil. And then he's like, what? And it's like, yeah, I mean, I guess so, but like, you don't need to have that much of a breakdown about it. I mean, I'd be messed up, but you know, it's still pretty.
I think the reason why that works in terms of pacing, because like from like if you were thinking of it like genuinely just from the numbers angle, right, of like how you'd break a story down, that doesn't really directly work too well. But I think for the context of the story, it works quite well in the sense of Subaru gets that moment with Sotelo, and he's supposed to have that confidence of he can solve this problem. But there's no tension in the story if there's not a threat, right? So sure. I think Roswaal having that moment was really important to make sure that the audience could know that it could go wrong in this last loop. Like, it's very unlikely to if you think about how the direction the story is going. But Teppei could pull that out his arse if he wanted to. He could make it.
This is before we establish, and we do get the immediate regression from him feeling confident and better to back to panic, and then back to confident and better, which I think is a little bit of whiplash. But season 2 was facing time issues of fitting everything into that first half of the season anyway, which they just decided to say, screw it, we'll buy our commercial slot for the second half. which is why the second half flows better and paces better. Breaking down, okay, where we have to deal with A, B, C, D, and here are the pieces on the board, and just piecing it together and talking through the issue is something that, as someone who has similar mental health issues as he do, specifically with the anxiety and getting overwhelmed like that, that is a necessary step to work through a problem like that. And I know that he did do it with
I just want
Otto,
to see it.
and he does it with Rem in season 1, right after the From Zero speech to go over everything. And he does it with Amelia when he's walking her through with what they all need to do next. And I know that it happens again in later arcs when they piece together what they have to do. I just want to see it. And I think it's kind of a shame that we don't get to have that with his character.
Yeah. This, and I will say that's kind of my major criticism with his character and the story that I have, personally. That's my big one, is that I don't need to see lots more of it. I just need to see a bit more of that slow down, seeing Subaru work through that. Because I think that's an idea that fascinates me. I want to see it. I want to read it. So,
you know, it's interesting. I think we're getting to the point of Subaru in which I think Teppei trusts us. I mean, especially in the novels, he trusts us so much with Subaru that, like, until we get to a substantial break point, he's just going to be like, this is what Subaru says, this is what Subaru does. And you have to intuit the narrative meaning behind why he's struggling with this or that, you know? I mean, of course, Subaru's entire journey is something that you're always going to be on, but, like, it's, I think it's always nice to be, like, understated moments as well as, like, longer stated moments.
Yeah.
The balance of that is something that, you know, because, like, there's some arcs that are just all about Subaru, right? And then, like, being able to be like, okay, let's calm down, right? Let's calm down, let's think about other characters, too, is something that I feel like he needs to, like, I mean, I think it was in the right place a lot of times, right? But I think it's something that I feel like he's going to exhaust him when he's, like, running around too many circles or, like, you know, too many loops, I should say.
Yeah. I think that's all pretty fair criticisms. If we were going to go into the web novel, there are some other issues that Teppei had with writing him early on, but honestly, that doesn't really matter because it's not canon.
That's not who Subaru actually is that we know.
Nope. That was even in
the modern release of the web novel, by the way.
Yeah, there's still modifications and changes between Teppei's unfiltered, I'm just throwing thoughts on paper or on computer sitting from the toilet because he makes himself sick and writes 3 chapters in the same night,
to the actualization of Subaru as a character.
Yes, to filtering it down, editing it, and saying, this is the character I'm writing. But from there, speaking of, as you mentioned, Gold, switching focus from Subaru to other characters, and, like, what they mean to him and what they mean to the story. We've hit on a couple, like the minor ones, like between him and Roswaal and Reinhardt, and even Julius to an extent, which, while deeper than those two, is still not, like, too thematically deep on its own, even if it's a closer relationship.
Can I make a request?
Yes.
We each get one, just one, so we don't talk about every single one. Because I know we could all talk about every single one.
I was going to say we should focus on the important 4, but we can bring it down to 3.
True. We get to pick which one's which. I'll pick, man. Actually, yeah, let's go in order of importance. Who wants to do Amelia? I'll do Amelia, sure.
That's telling that none of us want to do her.
Yeah. Okay, so they are both 2 normal people struggling with identity. right?
Yes.
I think that's one of the main sticking points. But I also think it was very clever to have him, fixate on her. Like the sort of, like he has this personality where he wants to cling to her, and has this very egocentric view about what he deserves. He deserves to have the hot woman that he likes.
Yeah,
he deserves to.
At the first is just to be with her.
Yeah.
Initially.
And I think, like, more clear than any other character, because we see the entire trajectory. We see him treat Emilia the most truthful out of any other character. He's seen Emilia at her worst, seen Emilia at her best. Not only does he see her at her best, he believes in her being better, right? Mm-hmm. And he's so invested in it that he's willing to knight himself in order to make that future a reality. And it's an investment. He sees all the flaws. And I think, Emilia as a character is very interesting because she, she is so, I would say, like, right? There's this, like, conviction that she has about right and wrong that sometimes is naive, but also sometimes is very beautiful in the way that she sticks up for people and the way that she sacrifices herself. She's self-sacrificing like Subaru. Another thing I think they have in common.
They do, and that's all her virtue for wanting to see the right thing done and, like, see the best in people and be almost that naive, good person who not in line with how the world works. But that isn't something Subaru ever discourages either. He always backs her up on it. He supports that. He wants to encourage her to keep that because it is something that he genuinely loves about her.
And I think the moment Subaru is truly someone that loves Emilia is when he recognizes these flaws about her, but loves them just as much as her positives anyway. Because that encapsulates love truly, I think, is knowing people's flaws, but also seeing the positive side of them and loving them for these little inconsistencies and flaws, because that's what makes you human.
Regardless of when Subaru actually says the words, at what point do you think he really was
in episode 18? And the reason I say that is because Subaru at that point is so wrapped up in his own tragedies, the way he feels about the world, that he's imposing that on Emilia and imposing his ideal version of Emilia on Emilia. So when he actually breaks down to Rem and, like, explains why he hates himself and all of his flaws, I think it helps him recognize some of Emilia's flaws. I know this isn't a thing that's consciously stated in the story, but that's my interpretation of when that starts to happen, especially because at the end of that scene, he talks about how he's watching Emilia and Rem is watching him, right?
Mm-hmm. And it's not like he doesn't know her flaws. He spells them all out to her when he's giving her the failed Rem speech in season 2 that doesn't go nearly as smoothly.
Yeah, but yeah. I think that's the true moment where Subaru has genuine, true love for Emilia, and it's not the idea of Emilia that he loves. He still works through that and that sort of concept and his anxiety about approaching Emilia after everything that happened. But I think that's the true moment Subaru is like, come on, I have to wake up. This is not how I should treat her.
Yeah. I have an interesting thing, and I know what the easy answer might be, which is when he has the fight with her, right? I think that's and then he kisses her, right? I think that's a very poignant moment, but I think when Subaru realizes it is actually a little bit earlier than that. And I think it's one that people don't think about. It's when she goes insane, waiting for Subaru. Because he sees the sick, dark, twisted perversion that, Roswaal made of her by torturing her. Yeah. And he sees like the darkness inside of her, but he also sees, like, the fact that somebody distinguished it and the sheer disgust and hatred that he had that somebody strengthens conviction of, I need to make sure that I see her issues. I need to make sure that this never happens ever again. That she doesn't become a witch. That she becomes, Emilia, just Emilia.
My point's in between the two of yours then, because even though he does say like ski love about Emilia to Rem at that point, I don't think he's genuinely like truly feels love for her quite yet, or at least not recognizing it within himself and like actively feeling that emotion properly. My point was a little bit after that, when he gets from Betelgeuse what Emilia was for, which he gets the hint for a little bit sooner than that, but getting the full explanation, I think it's the same loop, like right before they kill Betelgeuse the first time successfully, or before Wilhelm chops him in half, and he finds out that she's just supposed to be this vessel, and Subaru like spits back of, oh, she's just this tool for you, not even a real person worthy of anything else. Mentioning kind of the same way he was seeing her at the beginning of the story, and recognizing the fault in that, to me, is when I could say that, oh, he does genuinely love her at that point.
Do you know what? The one thing I do like about all of our interpretations of that is I enjoy every single one of them. I can see each one.
Like, I would say that that's the point where he goes from ski to I, or daisuki to aishiteru.
Yeah, I can see that. That's a good point. I mean, I didn't catch that parallel, but yeah, you're right.
All right, Wolf, do you want to grab your next meaningful relationship?
Of the two, would it be, I guess, Rem and...
I mean, you can just pick anyone, really.
Do you know what? I'm going to pick my favourite character, Ram. And the reason I'm going to pick Ram, now I think about it, is because of how interesting her relationship with Subaru is throughout the story.
This is crazy, by the way.
It's definitely the most unique, and I am really mad I wasn't going to go, because I was going to also say Ram. All right, go ahead.
I love all of the character interactions in this story, but there is nothing I love more than reading dialogue between Ram and Subaru, because not only is it really, really funny, but it's also very endearing. Ram is the perfect example of a really good friend for Subaru, because she humbles him. She will always let him know what his flaws are, but whenever she compliments him, it means something, and it genuinely affects him. And that I don't think he's had that female figure in his life up until this point, because he's only really had his mother, right? Which is the very kind, endearing type, but he's never had a woman in his life who challenges him truly. And
not at all.
And I think it's really cool to see that interaction with Subaru and how he grows as a better person. Like, you can see it through his interactions with Ram.
I really enjoy their relationship it is a sibling relationship.
Yes.
Even though Rem is her actual sibling, it's really telling to me that, for one, throughout Arc 2 in the novels, he calls her sister. He calls her Ne-sama, the same thing that Rem does, which, I mean, it's partly to tease her.
It's really cute.
She has an older sister relationship to Subaru, even after she loses her actual sister and all memories of that. Their relationship does not change at all. Subaru is still teased by her in the exact same way. They are still able to rely on each other for everything, complete trust in one another. It is one where I'm always delighted when it shows up on screen.
Me too. And it's like a really heartwarming aspect of the story, because I think, because obviously we don't see these thoughts, this is just interpretation, but I think maybe a part of Subaru, especially as an only child, always wanted that older sibling, right?
I think he does say that explicitly to Rem in the books, that really? I always wanted an older sister. Or, like, I'm jealous that you got to have a sibling, I always wanted one of my own, or something.
Maybe
I
missed that then, but yeah, like, genuinely, I think she fills that role for him, of that older sister, the one that protects him, but also chides him and tells him when he's wrong, but is always gonna trust him and always believe in him, no matter the situation. Like, as Ram says, he always has good timing. Ram will always trust in Subaru, even if she thinks he's a fool. And I think that undying, like, devotion and love of that sibling relationship is just so beautiful.
Well, because part of it is also her identity and goal is not focused on Subaru.
Yes.
And she's probably the one who is closest to him on an emotional and relationship level where that is the case. everyone else is either like focused on the exact same goal that he has, is directly there because of him, or is someone whose focus is on Subaru, whether it is trying to improve him, be with him, live up to the person that he presents himself as, or anything else. Rom is unique in that hers is to herself, to her sister, and to Roswaal. Subaru is just an afterthought to her story. But I guess speaking of sisters, the next relationship I would talk about here is
Beatrice.
It is actually Beatrice. I'm going for the young. I was going to make the joke of say it's the younger sister here, and that is Beatrice. Actually, in hindsight, I think he may have talked about wanting a sibling with Beatrice, but the point still stands that he didn't have that growing up. But Beatrice is a unique relationship to him, and obviously a super important one. They're spirit contractor and host. They're literal partners that share magic. She's decided to make him the most important person to her through her own choice. But she's also a reflection of his past. Like, she is the way he can go forward. She's his connecting point to the world as it is now. But where he pulls her out of is, well, where he started. She is a shut-in. She is a hikikomori just as much as he was, terrified of going out, waiting for someone else to take an action, just like he was waiting for his parents to kick him out.
And tell them who they are. You know, she wants somebody to tell her who she is.
Yeah, there is supposed to be a direct order to her life, just like there was supposed to be for Subaru. And a long time ago, they lost that. They both lost it. She lost when the book stopped telling the future, when he stopped being able to be like the gifted kid and keep up with who his father was. And then they just had to make it up as they went until they got to the point where they just both wanted to end it. And they just wanted it to be over and done with. And I think it's really amazing that Subaru gets to pull his past self, or someone just in the same position, out of that hole and gives them everything that they need to get them out of it themselves.
I guess in a sense it's almost showing, even if he's not consciously recognizing it, empathy to his previous self, right?
Exactly, yes. And
which is really sweet.
And then beyond the sort of narrative connection, the relationship they have, I also really like that it kind of changes every single scene, like which one of them is the dominant one in the relationship.
It's interesting because, sorry, I was about to say, it's interesting because it is almost impossible to put a label on exactly what it is. You said we have like this weird sort of like pseudo-romantic, sort of pseudo-familial connection that's like it's very it's interesting and endearing.
And contractor, right? That relationship is what that is. Not a thing we know of in the real world. This is what a spirit and contractor are in the world of ReZero.
I mean, they're partners, and what their relationship is doesn't have to have a label, because the dynamic changes each time.
Yeah.
Like, it does go from Beatrice caring for Subaru and wanting to like help him and watch over him, and whether that's healing him or protecting him, to him doing the same thing and holding it, like wrapping his arms around her and comforting her and giving her the love and attention she's never had, to them fighting as equals on the battlefield together. Like, it's in a dynamic switch between him acting like an older brother or just a partner to almost like a father to her, to then her acting like a older sibling, or they still use the word older sister in Japanese, but the concept is just a nei-san, which is just like a lady, a big girl, the grown-up, the one that you kind of look up to. An older woman in some anime.
Yeah, I guess unlike a lot of the other relationships in the story that we see in general, because even with other spirit contracts like Puck and Amelia, that is not an equal relationship. Subaru and Beatrice's relationship is a equal relationship. They shift dynamically, but they play each other's roles for each other when they need it. They can always fulfill a role that each other need.
The other even spirit relationships we see are also fairly static ones. Like, Puck is the paternal figure to Amelia, even when he's, I might add, very poorly,
Yes,
but he's
very
still
poorly.
doing it. Julius's spirits are all like almost like one step above a pet to him,
Yeah.
where they're all contracted and he's raising them up. He calls them buds, like flower
Like
buds.
flowers, yeah.
He obviously cares for them deeply, but it is still like he's definitely the higher one in that relationship for it. And we don't really get to see too many other relationships and contracts with great spirits or too many other spirit users in general at that point.
I wonder...
But Subaru's definitely got one that's unique with Beatrice, and I mean, I speak for a lot of people when I say that it is the best part to come out of season 2.
Yes.
For a treat with season 3 between these two. It's just so good the entire time.
If you're an anime only, look forward to the fluff. And I mean the fluff, because it's so cute.
There's a reason that's the first, like, 3 things you get in the trailer.
Yes. I think when it comes to... as we kind of mention and wrap up this, I think it's kind of interesting we talk about, like, spirits and, like, their static relationships versus Subaru's dynamic one with Beatrice. Do you think... I don't think Subaru has this innate high level of spirit attraction that's, like, built into him. It's almost like being who Subaru is, he has that level of spirit attraction. Do you know what I mean? Like,
well, it's not innate the way that Julius is an
Yeah.
innate one. It's innate that he, just the personality and kind of person he is, happens to attract spirits. I think Amelia mentions that most people are afraid of them, and Subaru never has that apprehension at all.
Well, because to him, they're a whimsical, beautiful thing, right?
I mean, he doesn't even know that the first 2 spirits he meets are even spirits until, like, way later.
Well, yeah, I guess, unlike any other character in the series, he treats spirits as another human, right? Like
Effectively.
another living being. Whereas
He doesn't call them great spirits, spirit sama, or anything like that.
other characters we see either revere them or are afraid of them.
Typically both.
Or typically both, yeah. Whereas Subaru is just down to earth and treats them like any other person. We love our Subaru.
We do love our Subaru, and I hope you've grown to love Subaru just a little bit more after listening to us ramble on about him for 2 hours.
Yeah, because this was a really fun episode to record, and I really, especially if you've listened up to this point, please write in the comments your interpretations of Subaru and how maybe they relate to yourself, or, for instance, what you feel about him. I really want to know about it. I will read every single one.
Yeah, Subaru is an incredibly important character to me. Just for who I am as a person now, and just because I love to read him as a story. And I really looked forward to seeing everyone else's view of him, even if it's simple as, I wish he was stronger. I still want to know how popular that opinion really is.
I wish he had his 8-pack.
I wish he was lust if Subaru.
Oh, God. Oh, God.
Someone out there thinks that.
There is someone. There's someone out there in the deep space that believes that. But at the end of the day, this was just a really from the heart episode of talking about why we love this character so much, and we'd like to hear what you love about this character, or maybe what you don't love. Ooh.
And, just as important, which character you want us to kind of deep dive into next.
Yes! Please tell us, is there any character you want to hear a deep dive on? Or is there any, in particular, like, moving on from characters, like subjects you want us to talk about? Because we have, like, an infinite amount of content that we could make for this series. It's more just what you guys would like to see. So I guess, with all that, we should wrap up for today. Thank you, everyone. If you've watched up to this point, this was a lot of fun to make. And I hope you all have a wonderful day or evening, wherever you are.
Yeah, I do as well. All right,
Thank you all
bye-bye.
so much for watching. Bye-bye.
Bye!
Bye.
Bye.